Um, Thank you for your time. The topic of this talk is going to be slightly different than the previous two talks, as it's about end user privacy in OAuth as opposed to security. My name is Srivathsan Morkonda. I'm a PhD student at Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada. My advisors are Professor Sonia Chiasson and Professor Paul Van Oschot. To give an overview of this talk, in the first 15 minutes or so, I'll present the findings from our study that we recently published at the WPS conference. This study was about single sign-on privacy in sites that use OAuth and OpenID Connect. Once I've presented the findings, I'll discuss what it means for end user privacy and also discuss some ideas for improving privacy in OAuth. We are in early stage of this work, so we would appreciate any input or suggestions you might have on how to improve OAuth privacy for users. So in our study, we first identified the popular ID providers that are supported by the Alexa top 500 sites. We found that the most popular IDPs were Google, Apple, and Facebook. In addition to these three, we also included LinkedIn in our study to consider sites related to both personal and professional user data. Using a custom tool that I'll describe in the next slide, we collected information on what user data each relying party site requests to these four ID providers. So if a site supports only two of these ID providers, we would collect data from those two ID providers. But we considered all the four ID providers in the top 500 sites. So we considered the top 500 sites in each of 5 countries, including Australia, Canada, Germany, India, and the US. We wanted to include these countries because they have different privacy laws, and we wanted to see if it had any impact on the privacy of RP sites. So using the Selenium browser automation framework, we built OAuth Scope to automatically scan a site for OAuth-based logins and extract the authorization requests made by the site to ID providers. So starting on a site's landing page, our tool searches and clicks on each IDP login it finds on the site. So in this example shown here, reddit.com supports IDP logins with Google and Apple. Our tool would click on each of these to extract the authorization parameters, including the scope values and the response type values used by the RP. Using this information, we studied what user information is requested by the top 500 sites. With the help of our tool, we covered 4 ID providers in the top 500 sites in each of 5 countries. To account for any differences in countries that sites might show, we used a VPN service to appear as visiting from that country when we collected data from the top sites of that country. In total, we found 815 relying parties with at least one of the 4 IDP options listed on their sites. And here's the breakdown for the country-specific numbers. In our analysis, we looked for variations in privacy offered by relying parties when visiting from different countries. Now I'll show some examples of the types of differences we found. Rakuten is a cashback website for online shopping. It's popular in certain countries, including Canada and the US. The screenshots here show the login dialogues shown to users of both the countries. First, you can see that in Canada, Facebook and Apple IDP options are offered. But in the US, in addition to Facebook and Apple, Continue with Google is also offered. And interestingly, with the Google option, the site requests access to the user's email messages, which can be a significant privacy concern. Users in other countries in our list do not see this option for this site. When comparing RP sites in US and Germany, we found that some sites offer less choices to users in Germany. For example, when connecting to slickdeals.net in the US, we see a login dialog with 2 IDP options listed, and also an option to create an account on the site. However, in Germany, the same site explicitly states that due to GDPR regulations, it does not support any accounts. So users of this site are not provided with the same level of functionality in all locations. Another type of difference we noticed is where sites will show the same login options in both countries, but refuse to proceed when selecting an option from one country. On the left here, clicking sign in with Google will on this site, people.com, will open a login prompt of the IDP page. But when connecting from Germany, we see an error message stating that this feature is not available in the user's location. We also saw the same error with the other two options shown here, Facebook and the email. For each RP site in the US, we compared the IDP options listed by the site when visiting both from US and from Germany. And here are the numbers that we found. We found that 80 of 184 relying parties showed a different version in Germany. The differences being regional changes such as content or language options. Of these 80 sites, 17 of them showed fewer or no IDP options at all. And also, we did not see any cases where an RP requested more data in Germany than in US. And this suggests that due to stricter privacy laws, some sites offer limited functionality to users in those regions. And also, although we only looked at Germany, it is possible that all users in the EU are offered fewer choices. To understand the privacy implications for users, we also looked at which OAuth flows, which OAuth and OpenID Connect flows are being used by the top 500 sites. Specifically, we were most interested in seeing how many sites were using the implicit flow. This graph highlights the number of relying parties in the top 500 sites per country that use the implicit flow. For each country, it shows the total number of RPs that have the IDP login, and also the percentage of relying parties that use the implicit flow. So for example, in the top 500 sites in India, 144 of them support Facebook login. And of these, we find 62 sites are around 43% of sites using the implicit flow. On the other end of this chart, the top sites in Germany, we find that the implicit flow is used much less compared to the top sites in other countries we looked. The final question we looked at was when a site offered multiple IDP choices, whether there were any differences in privacy offered in the individual choices on the same site. We noticed a strange pattern where some of the IDP options listed on a site's login page are not present in the sign up page. For example, Spotify's login page shows IDP options with Facebook, Apple, and Google. However, its sign up page only shows the Facebook option. And in glassdoor.ca, again, Apple option is missing in the sign up page. And in TikTok, both Instagram and Apple options are not listed on the sign up page. What this could mean for users is that if users go to the sign up page first when they're signing into the site for the first time, they might choose from the options listed there instead of choosing from the full list. So for Spotify, they might think that only Facebook is the option if they want to use SSO and not see the other two options. And also, we're not sure why Apple option seems to be missing in many sites like this. But if anyone knows more about this, I'd be curious to know. To help us compare the requested data attributes across different ID providers, we came up with 5 categories to group the scope values provided by the IDPs, Google, Facebook, Apple, and LinkedIn. In the rows, we group each attribute of personal user data in the most relevant category. For example, we consider the user's birthday or hometown to be related to the identity category, since it can be used to get the identity of the user in real world. And for example, the list of Facebook likes that the user has has entered in the site will be considered the interest category. But broadly, these attributes can be grouped into two categories. One that contains basic information that an app might need to identify its users. For example, the user's name or email address. And the other group contains more personal data attributes, such as photo libraries, home addresses, or even email content. In the next few slides, I'll refer to these attributes as basic and non-basic attributes. In this table, we show the sites that request a minimum of 2 non-basic attributes from any of the 4 ID providers. For example, well, first the columns, I'll explain the columns here. The columns list the individual attributes that are grouped into 4 parts to show the 4 ID providers that we considered. The first being for Facebook, Google, Apple, and LinkedIn. And the dots in each row indicate that the attribute is requested by the site through that specific IDP option. So if a cell is empty, it just means that the IDP option is not offered by the site. As an example here, Airbnb has IDP options with Facebook, Google, and Apple. With Google or Apple, it only requests basic information about the user, which will be the user's name or email address. However, with Facebook, it requests the user's location, a list of Facebook page likes, a user's birthday, and also a list of the user's friends. So from this table, we see that RPs often request considerably different amounts of data from each IDP choice they offer to users. We found 146 relying party sites in the US listing at least 2 of the 4 ID providers in our study. Among these relying parties, 43 of them request a different category of data from each IDP choice. We also found that 42 of these 43 sites have an option that only requests basic information while requesting a lot more data through the other options. What this suggests is that often some IDP choices on a site might be less privacy friendly than others on the same site. We saw another interesting pattern in which 30 of these sites, the options collecting more data were listed as the first login option, suggesting a possible dark pattern where users are nudged into choosing options that will reveal more data. If you haven't heard of dark patterns, they're defined as intentionally manipulative designs to get users to do something that may not be in their best interest. For example, when you are shopping online, you might notice a countdown timer that some sites use to get you to complete the purchase immediately. What we see here could be an example of an intentional design to get users to share more data, or it could just be a side effect of an unrelated design choice. So what does this all mean for the privacy of end users? In this slide, we show the user interface designs used by Facebook, Google, and Apple. In these logins, users are first prompted to enter their username and password before seeing which data is being requested by the site. We refer to these time before and after which the user has selected a choice as pre-visibility and post-visibility. So in pre-visibility, users only see a list of login options. So in this example, if we say that the user decides to go with Facebook, they will enter their credentials and complete two-factor authentication if they've enabled it. And when they do see the permissions requested, they do not have information about the other 2 choices here, Google and Apple. So when they see this, they might just simply grant these permissions in order to get to the site, in order to log in and get to the site. Otherwise, they would have to log in through each of the options and see which data is being requested with each option to compare. So users might not have all the information they need to make an informed login choice. What could help here is providing information about the requested permissions before asking the user to log in to reduce the load that they might have to do to see the requested permissions. And next is, given that many sites are still using the implicit flow, as a user, I would prefer to see some indication of whether a site follows good security practices. For example, something like a padlock icon could be used when a site uses the authorization code flow with Pixie. And lastly, our findings suggest that some relying parties might be using certain designs to get users to choose options and reveal more of their data. But we're not sure if these are actually dark patterns or just a side effect of unrelated choices. Now I'd like to discuss some ideas we have for improving user privacy in OAuth logins. The minimum information that privacy conscious users would need to know to make an informed choice is what information is shared to the relying party sites and how it gets used. Our intention of a standard here is not to force every site into making the same choices when it comes to requesting permissions. Rather, we suggest that when similar attributes are requested by sites, having a consistent terminology could make it easier for users to understand. For example, if a site requests access to the contacts attribute with Google and the friends attribute with Facebook, a similar description could be used for both to help the user understand what they mean. What could also help users understand the privacy implications is providing them a comparative information about the IDP choices available on a site. Now I'd like to show two examples of standardized descriptions that have been proposed before for informing users about privacy. Here's an example of a privacy nutrition label proposed by a group at Carnegie Mellon University. The first column here shows which data is collected by the site. And the next column show how they are used, either by the first party site itself or anyone the site shares the data with. It also highlights what access controls are available for users for such as opting in or opting out of certain data sharing practices. And more recently, Apple introduced its own version of privacy labels, where they show which data is shared with an app and how it gets used. A common theme in both of these examples is a consistent format is used for the labels to make it easier for the user to understand the privacy implications. Here we list some other ideas that could help to improve privacy. First is a browser extension could offer comparative information on IDP choices before the user decides to go with one of the choices. For example, when the user is browsing a site, information about what data is shared through the IDPs could be displayed to the user. The second point here is a community effort could lead to creating a reputation system, like a crowdsourced reputation system, where anyone can contribute information about sites and their privacy. For example, a similar community effort in the two-factor authentication directory project or 2FA directory project, anyone can submit an entry about a site and whether it supports two-factor authentication or not. And another example of a third-party rating system is the markup project's Blacklight tool. If you input a URL in this tool will tell you what kind of tracking practices are used on the site. And lastly, I'd like to ask these questions. As a user, what information would you like to see in order to make privacy-informed choices? Next is, do you think any of our results indeed suggest evidence of dark pattern designs in an effort to maybe get access to more user data? And do you suggest any other ideas that might be worth pursuing, for instance, to inform users about privacy? And finally, do you feel any of the things we've discussed are worth considering in some future version of OAuth? Thank you very much for your time. Here's my contact info if you would like to connect with us. And if you have any questions or suggestions, I'd be happy to listen now.
Hey Shri, it's Mark Kane here. Just one thing that sprang to mind. Have you considered that the order may be, the order of the IDPs may be the order of preference by the relying party at that point in time, and that the missing IDPs might simply be there for backwards compatibility?
Right. Yeah, that is possible because we did see that Facebook was the most popular option that's listed as first. So this could just mean that the relying parties are just listing it because Facebook is more popular than is a more popular social media platform. So it is possible. I think that's
Or
valid.
what I was getting at really was more popular with RPs because they're able to get more data out of it potentially.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So if that is the case, if it was an intentional design to get users to choose that option as opposed to the other ones, then it is a dark pattern, I would say. I see your hands up. You asked your question?
Yeah, so we honestly have a hard enough time in industry getting people to use even consistent protocols on the wire. To me, it seems that an effort to get them to have consistent language and UX is going to be a much, much bigger lift. And what are your thoughts on the feasibility of any advice that these standards groups come up with being adopted?
Right.
By anyone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. I think ideally the relying party itself should indicate to users what data they're going to collect from each IDP option, and suggest to the user how they're going to be used. So implementing a consistent terminology across ID providers will be difficult, but I think our recommendation is more for the relying parties on that point, to indicate to users, maybe in the privacy policy, be more explicit on the different privacy in the options. But yeah, I think that's a valid point. Okay, so I don't see any other questions, but if I missed, let me know. Otherwise, thank you very much for your time. And if you have any questions, or if you would like to connect with us, do feel free to email me or connect with me on LinkedIn.
All right. Thank you